The following podcast is a result of a recent CBC Fifth Estate investigative report claiming that Buffy Sainte-Marie is neither Canadian nor Indigenous. It has become quite a divisive issue. I'm Larry Fedorik, and this is Later That Same Life. On this weekly podcast, topics, discussions, stories from our lives.
Season 10, Chapter 12.
Buffy Sainte-Marie?
Buffy Sainte-Marie, you're right.
For those who don't know, Buffy Sainte-Marie is a singer, songwriter, musician, and multi-level artist who has been active in 7 different decades. At age 82, she only recently retired from performing live. And over the years, her career and name have been associated with Indigenous culture, rights, and recognition. The Fifth Estate is an investigative journalism television show that has been on the air at the CBC Canada for almost 50 years. Recently, the Fifth Estate aired an episode raising doubt over Buffy Sainte-Marie's Indigenous roots, her Canadian birth, and the story and identity she has maintained for over 60 years. The full episode is available on YouTube. Search YouTube Fifth Estate Buffy Sainte-Marie and you should find it easily. I urge people to watch it before forming an opinion. I wouldn't describe myself as a big fan of Buffy Sainte-Marie. Also, I'm not a fan. I guess more so I've been appreciative of her career. First of all, the longevity is to be admired, especially a woman in show business. Also, her unwavering social consciousness. And lastly, we all grew up believing that she was born in Saskatchewan, a few hours south from where I was born. Wow, someone from the middle of nowhere made it worldwide. So there's hope for the rest of us who may want to do the same. If the basis of all this career success is a falsehood, I think it's worth examining. As this possibility began to surface and the CBC story began to break, I started to notice this public reaction. And at first, I felt the same way. I had the same initial gut feeling. And that was, why pick on Buffy Sainte-Marie? Why tear down a Canadian and Indigenous icon? She's 82. Why now? Isn't there something more pressing that investigative journalists should be digging into? Yeah, I suppose on that last one, we do tend to rank some truths as more important or more relevant than others. I think this story is especially relevant to Indigenous peoples. And naturally, even they would disagree on the necessity for such an expose. I also believe that status, wealth, even past good deeds can't just cancel someone's lies. Is Buffy Sainte-Marie lying about her Canadian and Indigenous roots? Even when presented with evidence, opinions still vary. Everyone agrees that Beverly, known as Buffy Sainte-Marie, was raised by Alfred and Winifred Sainte-Marie, also sometimes known as Saint Marie, in a mostly white Christian small town near Boston, Massachusetts. Beverly was born in 1941, although the adult Buffy claims not to know her actual birth day. By the early 1960s, this young Massachusetts girl made her way to the coffee houses of Greenwich Village in New York City, a growing folk music scene that was getting national attention. Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, and Buffy Sainte-Marie. In 1964, Buffy was named Billboard magazine's top new artist of the year. It was in those early years of success that Buffy's Indigenous claims began to emerge. At first, it was just brief mentions in newspapers of this hot new folk singer who's also a North American Indian, which was the popular label of the day. She was an Algonquin, then later Mi'kmaq, then eventually a more consistent story that she was a Cree born in Saskatchewan and at a very young age adopted to the Santa Maria family in Massachusetts. Her American family, a younger sister, older brother, uncles, aunts, grandparents, in-laws, though initially proud of her success, were suddenly questioning why Buffy would make these claims about her origins. Remember, it's not just that her claims became a small part of her backstory, an answer to a music trivia question. Hey, did you know Buffy Sainte-Marie is also an American Indian? No. This claim became part of who she was, her identity as a known performer. Certainly a birth certificate would solve the puzzle. Buffy Sainte-Marie has always said that no records exist, that records involving Indigenous children were locked away or even destroyed. In fact, the opposite is true. There's no history of any records being destroyed. As a matter of fact, governments tended to document Aboriginals even more so, to keep track of them and control them. At times, Buffy has claimed to be part of the so-called 60s scoop, a practice we've become well aware of, where Canadian Indian children were scooped from their families and adopted to white families. The scoop, along with the practice of residential schools, were meant to rob Indigenous peoples of their culture, to westernize them, convert them to Christianity, beat the Indian out of them if necessary. Yes, this happened. The so-called 60s scoop actually began around 1951. Buffy Sainte-Marie was born in 1941. The idea that no records of her birth exist has been proven false by the Fifth Estate investigation. They traveled to her county in Massachusetts, where the town clerk was able to find the original paper record, the original birth certificate, signed by the attending physician, listing mother, father, and all pertinent information. Since then, Buffy's legal team has claimed that in the day, adopted Indian children were often issued false birth certificates to cover for the shady adoption practices. The Massachusetts county clerk in charge of records vehemently disagrees with this. She points out to the doctor's signature, other hospital records, and a sequential numbering of all the births in the area as proof that Beverly Jean Santa Maria was born to Alfred and Winifred in Massachusetts on February the 20th, 1941. The clerk absolutely refutes claims of a false birth certificate due to adoption. The living family members have no memory of whispers and rumors while growing up that Buffy might be adopted. She was always there, always part of the family. Now, I agree, sometimes these types of family secrets are well kept and they go to the grave. But no one still alive remembers any questions about Buffy's origins until they began reading about them in the press after she was famous. Actually, an uncle in the day made efforts to go to the papers and dispute Buffy's claims. Later, her older brother Alan would do the same. Living Sainte-Marie families say many were hurt by Buffy claiming she was not really one of them, especially the parents, Alfred and Winifred. Now deceased, never spoke publicly about it. In fact, privately encouraged others to ignore it. Ignore the issue for the trouble it might bring to them. Buffy's lie, as they knew it, was a well-known, rarely spoken of family secret. A couple of things happened in the early 70s that are crucial to this story. Buffy's older brother Alan had served many years in the American Air Force and subsequently had become a commercial airline pilot. One day, after safely landing his passenger aircraft, he stepped out of the cockpit, only to see that Buffy was deplaning, surrounded by a small entourage which included members of the press. A chance encounter. They greeted each other, hugged, all very loving and familial. But a few days later, media would contact Alan with a query. Are you actually Buffy's brother? because you don't look indigenous. A somewhat insensitive question, surely, but, it was the early 70s. John Wayne was still mowing down Indians in the movies. Alan said, well, yes, I am her brother, and I'm not indigenous, and neither is Buffy. This further inspired Alan to begin a letter-writing campaign to a few major newspapers in major cities. Buffy Sainte-Marie is not indigenous. No one called Alan back or published the story. Within a few weeks, however, Alan received a letter from an expensive Beverly Hills attorney, Buffy's lawyer, telling him to cease and desist interfering with Buffy's ability to earn income, and that if he persisted in writing these letters, he would be taken to court. Inside the same envelope was a handwritten note from Buffy, telling Alan that if he continued to tell the world that Buffy was not indigenous, she would tell the world that he was a pedophile, that how he used to sexually, physically, and verbally abuse her as a child. Now, Buffy has since repeated some of those claims that she was abused as a young girl by a family member, a brother, and I know the trauma of those kinds of events can often take years to unpack. I'm not discounting the claims or the mental anguish that go with them, or even not wanting to talk about such things. But it is interesting that Buffy's claims only first came out when she was threatened with exposure. After receiving those letters, Alan wrote to their father saying Buffy had sunk to a new low, and that he would in fact cease and desist because he could not afford to fight her in court. And all of these original documents, letters, exist, and they were presented to the Fifth Estate by Buffy's niece Heidi, Alan's daughter, in defense of her father. Shortly after these exchanges, Buffy began one of her most famous roles. She appeared on Sesame Street, bringing attention to the plight of the American Indian.
I'm just coming down from visiting my folks in Cree Reservation in Canada.
Oh, yeah?
Lord knows.
Oh, a reservation. Are you Indian?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, really?
My sister read me a story about Indians.
Was it a real story about Indians or was it a fairy tale?
It was a real one.
It was a real one. Because some of them are fairy tales and some of them are real. Some are just pretend and some are real.
Yeah.
I'm real.
So this brings us to why now? Why, after a 60-year career, one which not only brought us terrific music and performances, and of course all that much-needed attention to Indigenous issues, why now tell everyone it may have all been based on a lie? Here's what apparently happened. Last year, PBS in the States ran a big documentary on the life of Buffy Sainte-Marie. It was not only a must-watch for all of her fans, but for all the Indigenous activists, so they could learn more about this woman who had done so much for their cause. Instead, though, several Indigenous journalists, along with people involved in Native studies at a university level, noticed many inconsistencies in her story. More questions than answers. If that be, then how could that be? We call those red flags. Indigenous peoples around the world, well, others too, but notably Indigenous, object to something called cultural appropriation, the adoption of Indigenous practices or fashion by non-Indigenous folk. And beyond that, there are people they call pretendians, pun intended. Pretendians are those who falsely claim Aboriginal roots, especially for financial and cultural gain. Aboriginals are not alone in this. It's not cool to claim to be Italian, French, English, Jewish, or anything you really are not. But in these times, it is a particularly sensitive issue in Indigenous culture. In recent years, and these stories have made the news, some top authors and scholars and others have been exposed. Their Aboriginal ancestry claims were not only false, but in some cases a purposeful deception to gain opportunities recently afforded to the Indigenous, and by acquiring them under the false pretense, denying a real Indigenous person those same opportunities. So why now? Well, one of those Indigenous freelance journalists involved in uncovering these types of stories was watching the PBS documentary and called the CBC, a tip, if you will. And the Fifth Estate decided to investigate. Add the weeks and months they spent on the story, and now you know why now. And in defense of journalists, you can't really make these kind of editorial decisions based on a person's fame, fortune, or social status. Equal justice is not only a rule of law, it's a journalistic principle. Yeah, I know it doesn't always work, but you can't not do a story because your suspect is a beloved individual who's done some good work. You investigate, you search out the truth, and if there is a there, you share the story with the public based on evidence. Individuals, no matter how well intentioned, cannot write their own legacy, although many try. Since she came out of the scene, Buffy Sainte-Marie has not only donned the Native American clothing, but sang the songs. She was integral in the growing Red Power movement of the late 60s. She told the Indian story to children on Sesame Street. She helped fund the native occupation of Alcatraz when they claimed that the island should be returned to the First Nations. She won an Oscar for her role in writing the hit song Up Where We Belong. Hailed as the first Native American to do so. She's been a staple of CBC heritage shows. She has an Order of Canada, her own stamp, as well as many other awards meant exclusively for Indigenous peoples. At a relatively early point of her career, she went to Saskatchewan, to the nation she says she was born in, spoke to the people, made music, and was adopted by a Saskatchewan Cree family. She did all this and more, but not just as a supporter or an ally, but as someone who said she is Indigenous, a claim now in legitimate question. Three things are possible, right? One, Buffy Sainte-Marie is exactly who she says she is. Two, she is not, but she really believes she is. And three, she's lying and she knows it. Number three would, of course, be the worst. Oddly, people in our culture have been canceled for much less than what Buffy Sainte-Marie is implied to have done. I know what you're saying. I thought it too. A DNA test solves everything. There are Sainte-Marie family members out there. But what are the chances Buffy would take a DNA test right now? Unlikely. And stealing a coffee cup or used tissue from her trash may not be conclusive. And by the way, Buffy issued a response to this CBC show. She said that she found the allegations hurtful and that she knows who she loves and who loves her. That is a response, but not an answer. Personally, I'm inclined to believe that she was born in Massachusetts and is of half English, half Italian descent. Did she adopt a persona for personal gain? I have no idea. Has she done good with this persona? Yes, of course. Perhaps a compromise. We can question her background, perhaps even think something is amiss here, without canceling her music or her work. What's the worst sin? She made a lot of money. Should she give it all back? I'll recommend this because I've been reading a lot of opinion on this story and on Buffy herself. A lot of times, in the opinionated statements I read, it is evident that people haven't even watched the entire investigative segment. At least do that. Learn all you can before you speak out. Well, that's just a good rule for anything.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37 at gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.